It is so good to be together with you today. I have heard such good things about you from Penny that I had to come and hang out with you myself. She clearly loves you so much that she can't even tear herself away to take a full-time sabbatical. So I'm glad I could provide a little respite preaching today so she could preach at my church. Wait, that doesn't really work. But that sounds a lot like Penny, right? I have been blessed by Penny's friendship and wise mentoring since I arrived in the Bay Area from Boston 4 years ago when she reached out to support me in my new call. And now we have even more connection between our churches, not just Reverend Dick Norberg of blessed memory, who is connected to my church over a long time, but the wonderful Reverend Cheryl Johnson and the newly minted Reverend Kelly Caldwell. Can we cheer that again? It is good to have sister churches with strong ties in this moment, this sometimes difficult moment for progressive Christianity. It can be a very lonely and strange thing to be a Christian these days, particularly in the Bay Area. I thought Boston was a tough sell on church. But what I found pastoring there for almost 2 decades was that many Bostonians, while post-Christian on the surface, were that way because they had been wounded by bad religion. Christianity was a bad boyfriend they'd broken up with, but they secretly longed to get back together with them, reform him, and live happily ever after. And the churches I served were able to heal a lot of folks by offering an earnest apology and a desire to do better. My churches that I served there were places of truly unequivocal welcome for everyone who'd been hurt and rejected by church. And by embodying community, modeling the unconditional love of Jesus Christ, they became a kind of love school where we could all get better at loving ourselves and better at loving ourselves. Of course, because church is a bunch of humans, we were imperfect. We failed sometimes, and we fell short of the call of God to serve and love our neighbors, sometimes in very concrete ways. There was one winter at my church in Somerville, Massachusetts, when it snowed and snowed and snowed. Any other refugees from cold climates here? Raise your hand. Okay, I'm about to invoke a very painful memory. This is your trigger warning. If you need to take care of yourselves by leaving the room or putting your hands over your ears and saying la, 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 please go ahead. Okay, for those native Californians who are blissfully ignorant, when it snows in cold climate cities, it doesn't just snow like in a cute little snow globe way. It snows, and then it melts a little, and then it refreezes, and then it snows on top of that and melts a little and freezes, and then it snows on top of that. You get the idea. And our church was on a very busy pedestrian thoroughfare about 2 blocks from the subway. We were not a wealthy church, and we saved a lot of money by shoveling the sidewalks ourselves. A crew of members who called themselves the Snow Angels, all young working people, would come after a long day at work and clear the sidewalks for our neighbors. Except if it was a heavy, wet snow, it would get compacted by all the pedestrians before the Snow Angels could get there, and it was very hard to shovel. So this one winter in particular, we did what we could, but as the snows kept snowing and melting and refreezing, the passage down the sidewalk got narrower and lumpier and more difficult for folks pushing strollers or elders with mobility challenges to navigate. And when I said we sometimes failed our neighbors in concrete ways, I literally meant the snow had turned to concrete. And the neighbors were mad as hell. People started calling us out for having badly shoveled sidewalks on that great engine of making enemies, Nextdoor, the social media platform. And then the Somerville Moms listserv was up in arms about us. And when the Moms listserv is against you, woe betide you. Far from giving people safe passage and a wide welcome, we made the way narrow and dangerous for them. We were giving Christians, and our church in particular, a bad name. It didn't matter that the hippie vegan commune 2 doors down had given up shoveling 2 months earlier. We were Christians, and people hold us to a higher standard. And maybe they should. Because after all, it was our rabbi himself who said the now very familiar refrain, "But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you." This teaching isn't a secret. Even atheists and agnostics know it. And so when we fail to live it, they know we are hypocrites. It doesn't seem fair, though, does it? That we should have to give up so much to follow Jesus? That we should have to do so much more than ordinary people? I mean, is it possible that Jesus was, exaggerating a little bit? He was given to hyperbole. If you've done a deep dive into this text, and I hear there are a lot of seminary graduates in the room, you know that the second reference, the reference Jesus made to giving up both coat and cloak, is outright ridiculous if you take it literally, because in Jesus' day, people only wore 2 garments. So say you're standing in court, getting sued for your coat, and you suddenly willingly hand over not just your top garment, but your undergarment, you would find yourself naked in a court of law, which I'm sure has happened pretty frequently in Berkeley, where I'm from, but probably not a result of following Jesus' teachings literally. Then there's the bit about turning the other cheek when struck, or going the extra mile, a reference to the imperial law that said a soldier could compel a Roman subject to carry his gear for up to 1 mile. Did Jesus really intend to make oppressed people submit even further to their own oppression? Of course not. But he did and frequently ask people with privilege to give it up in the name of those without, in the name of revealing the oppression of others. I imagine, like at my church, you have a lot of conversations about race, whiteness, wealth, and other forms of privilege, and what we as people of faith can do with whatever forms of power and access are available to us to change the world for those who are suffering. Jesus isn't asking those who already have a boot on their necks to submit. He's asking those of us still standing to get down on the ground with them in order to reveal the essential inhumanity of our systems. Jesus goes on to tell us that we're not called just to love our friends, but even our enemies, and asks us to be perfect, even as our heavenly parent is perfect. We might have chosen an easier religion. You can go to hot yoga and still curse out the jerk in traffic on the way home, but you can't get away with that as a Christian. When I was a seminary student fresh out of college and a little less mature, I once flipped the bird to someone who cut me off in traffic, and it turned out to be my New Testament professor. You can imagine the many ways that was problematic. Here's a parable for how hard the path is for those who really, truly want to follow Jesus. A few weeks ago, I was on retreat with Penny and a dozen other senior ministers of West Coast UCC churches. We were diverse in age, personality, and many other markers, but we had Jesus in common and one other thing. We all hated to sit indoors all day. So after lunch, we went on a hike up the hill behind the retreat center, even though none of us had the right shoes, and 2 of us were afraid of heights, and 1 of us had a broken ankle that had just healed. And it turned out to be a more perilous path than we had thought. Very steep, muddy, slippery, and more than once we wanted to turn back. But going down at that point would have been harder than going up, so we just kept going. And when we got to the top, We were rewarded with amazing views. But then we had to find our way down. The journey's never done once we reach the mountaintop. We decided to take a less steep path, but before long found it was beset with cow plops. Giant cow plops. I'd never seen the likes of these cow plops. And navigating these cow plops, we discovered naturally what is at the end of a path of cow plops. Cows. And if you're very unlucky, a young bull who is feeling quite territorial. And on the other side of the bull, a barbed wire fence. And on the other side of the fence, the retreat center. Luckily, senior ministers are problem solvers. The eldest and wisest of us, Catherine, happened to be a farmer as well as a pastor, and she gave us some intel about the best path to take around the bull. And then Penny found a dead tree that allowed us access over the barbed wire fence. I'm very happy to report we didn't lose a single senior minister that day. But the parable came home to us. The way of Jesus is hard, beset with danger, and also cow plops. And yet, as hard as the path of following Jesus is, it matters that we do it. It matters how we do it, because the world is watching us. And you know what? Sometimes worse, they're not watching us. Because I decided that if in Boston Christianity is the bad boyfriend that spiritual seekers want to reform, in the Bay Area Christianity is the nerd, totally invisible to the tall, gorgeous, more popular spiritual paths like Buddhism or any form of New Ageism or the true religion of the Bay Area, brunch and a hike. How do we get seen? And if we do manage to get the attention of people who need a church like ours, a God like ours, how do we do what our teacher asked us? Be perfect. How do we keep a civil tongue when not only our Trump-voting uncle is blowing up our Facebook page, but even our Democrat friends are turning on each other in the cage-fighting match of the primary? How do we manage self and be the loving, giving, grace-filled people we long to be when the world is so hard and getting harder in many ways? I'm a relative newcomer to the Bay Area, but it feels like in just 4 short years, we've gotten more and more on edge around here. The desperation of our destitute neighbors is on grand display. And even the haves or the have-just-enoughs are suffering from a side-hustle, workaholic economy that wants to rob us of real life. Climate change, the border crisis, the slow reveal of just how racist and xenophobic even this part of America really is, are all in this simmering soup of discord. It's a recipe for polarization, self-protection, and the making of enemies, not friends. Dr. King said we could destroy our enemies by turning them into friends. But just how do we do this? Jesus was great at saying what to do, love our enemies, but not so great about how to do it. I think there's a clue in the word he used, perfect. Be perfect, he said. For many of us, this brings up old bad tapes from childhood. We've spent years in therapy to change. Just behave, be nice, keep the peace, work harder, give in, hide what's broken or ugly, sublimate your needs to the needs of others. It's a different kind of boot on the neck. And I don't think that's what Jesus intended at all. A close read of the word perfect tells us it doesn't mean without flaw. It means mature. It means whole. I think Jesus is actually asking us to keep growing up, always, into who God made us to be. I just wrote a parenting book, and I'll be talking about it after church today, as you've heard. And in case you don't make it to the talk, it's okay. I'll give you a little spoiler right now. God knitted every one of our children together in the womb and made them already exactly who they are, just as they are when they were born. Contrary to some of the strains of junk Christian theology, our kids are not raw material to be shaped or mixed bags to be rehabilitated. Our primary job as parents and grandparents and caregivers is to get to know and love the child God has given us, as they are and as they're becoming. If we do that, we're not perfect parents, but good enough parents, and good enough parenting is the goal. What if we could apply those same principles to ourselves and be good enough parents raising the child God has given every one of us, our own inner child, a child God already knows through and through, a child God couldn't love any better? If we could do that, if we could really love what we think of as the ugliest and most flawed parts of ourselves, we'd probably find it a lot easier to love our enemies. St. Dolly Parton said what Jesus said, but a little differently. She said we should find out who we are and then be ourselves on purpose. Jesus set nearly impossible standards for virtue. But in real life, he best friended the most diverse array of flawed people. What they all had in common was not kindness or radical generosity or courage or hope or great conflict resolution skills. What they all had in common was a willingness to keep growing up, to keep becoming who God intended them to be. Beloved, Lent is nearly upon us. Giving things up for Lent has kind of fallen out of favor, I hear, but in the name of Jesus, asking us to grow up, I invite you this Lent to a little extra adulting. Who is it in your heart of hearts that you know God made you to be? Can you lean into that self a little bit harder with concrete spiritual practices? Can you be yourself and be a follower of Jesus on purpose and let the world see what that looks like? Because the world, particularly our corner of it, really needs your hopefulness, your courage, your radical generosity, your peacemaking skills, whatever God gave you. It needs you, just as God made you, and as you are becoming, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile, to give it all away, to thaw the path toward loving even our enemies. And in so doing, we restore the good name of Jesus, and we make a wide and welcoming way where it seemed like there was no way at all. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. Amen.